Good morning. If you are watching this, that means for some reason there's been an emergency or a crisis or something has come up where I'm not able to preach last minute. I hope everything is okay. But I did want to prepare ahead of time for in the event that I got sick or something where we could still continue on with our worship service and everything would kind of go on as normal. I wanted to prepare ahead of time, and specifically, I wanted to record this video, just in case we were ever in need of maybe kind of a fill-in sermon last minute. But the other reason I guess I'm recording this too is that a little while ago I came across an article, a scholarly article that really opened up in a fresh way a very familiar Bible story for me, and I thought it would make a really excellent sermon, and it created a lot of really interesting thoughts and provoking ideas in my head. And so this isn't necessarily a finished product sermon necessarily, so you'll have to bear with me a little bit, but I did think it would provide a good fundamental premise for which to do this fill-in sermon, emergency sermon for us. So hopefully it doesn't drive you too crazy that we are recording this, that you're just watching a screen, but hopefully you can give us some grace given the circumstances. But this specifically, I wanted to give credit to Abraham Kuruvia. I believe that's how you pronounce his name. He's a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary who wrote the article that has really jogged, not my memory, but has, I guess, given me a refresher into all of these ideas, and he's provided a good foundation from which to work with. But when I was a kid growing up, as I got a little older, we'd pray around the dinner table as a family, and I noticed my younger siblings especially. I was probably doing the same thing, but my younger siblings especially, when it was their turn to pray for that particular meal, they always seemed to get it to say the same thing. In fact, it was almost like a memorized speech. It was so familiar to me. In fact, I can probably repeat it off the top of my head, something along the lines of, "Dear God, thank you for this day. Thank you for this food. Amen." Something real simple, real basic, but it was almost that exact same order, that exact same pace, those exact same words. And I always, at some point, I kind of got annoyed. But really, I was just immature, or realizing it was more important that they were praying. I don't want to throw my brothers and sisters under the bus. It was just, very familiar, a very kind of rote prayer, and that was okay for that context. But I thought of that because this particular story, David and Goliath, in 1 Samuel 17, is very much a familiar story to us. We could probably tell it off the top of our heads, that get the basics down pretty easily if we've gone to church for a long time. Even people outside of Christianity, outside of church, know the story well. That David and Goliath is a metaphor for any underdog who defeats a big-time opponent or enemy. But there's more below the surface than I think we tend to give it credit for. There are a lot of interesting nuances to the story, a lot of things going on that we probably don't catch just even on a surface level reading, because while we may think this is about David defeating a giant, I see more than one giant in this story. I see three giants, and I see different approaches to struggles, spiritual struggles, and there have been there's been a lot of interpretation over spiritualizing things about this story too, that kind of confuse the matter, that David is really Jesus and Goliath is Satan and sin and death, and those are okay. But again, I think there are significant truths that we can apply to our life from David and this giant problem he seems to have. Really, I think the crux of the matter is this: the key truth that we'll see weaved throughout this story in 1 Samuel 17 is that any battle and against any giant can be won by embodying three things. by doing three things: by embodying the right status, by utilizing the right resources, and by relying on the right experiences. Embodying the right status, utilizing the right resources, and relying on the right experience. Really, what it comes down to is a rejection of man's approach to struggles, to issues, to battles, and depending on God. Now, I do want to qualify this as we think. This is a military story. It's about a military battle, a one-on-one struggle, a physical fight. So I am going to, I guess, bridge it to our day and our situations to the extent where we're not talking about a one-on-one match in tennis or basketball or a boxing match, a real fight even. But I think we can qualify this. So when we talk about battles, any battle against any giant, well, a battle would be any situation where God's name is at stake, where God's honor is being repudiated, where his name is being maybe dragged through the mud or criticized or treated with disrespect. A battle would be any situation where God's name is at stake, because that is what is happening in this story. Goliath, is calling out not only the people of Israel and their armies, but also the name of God. He is very much challenging the Lord. So a battle would be for us any situation where God's name is at stake. I'm not talking about a battle in the sense of it's a flu that is preventing you from getting to work, or a battle is hitting all the red lights on the way to a concert or something like that. That we're not talking about battles that can be anything. We're talking about significant situations where God's name and God's honor are being questioned, are being challenged. Now, again, any battle against any giant, what are we talking about? Giants, physical giants? Are you talking about just big problems? Well, I would see a giant as any adversary that diminishes God's glory or hinders you in the pursuit of God's glory. So anything that stands in the way of you doing God's will, any one or anything that diminishes God's glory, that is disrespectful of God and dishonoring of God, because that is definitely who Goliath is and what he stands for. Now, as we read the story, again, I mentioned there are three giants, not just one. We know of Goliath, but I think there are more giants in play that David has to face, David has to conquer in this episode. And we kind of read of the first one kind of standing up and making himself known in the first few verses. And we go from a description of the situation to then David coming on the scene and having these conversations and then confronting Goliath himself, and then the resolution at the end of the story. Now, I will say this, the greater context of 1 Samuel is also helpful to understand and remember. 1 Samuel 17, God has appointed Saul as king because the people were clamoring for it. They wanted it. He let them have what they wanted, but he told them it wasn't going to end well, and of course it doesn't. Saul disobeys the Lord several times, and finally in chapter 15, it's the last straw that breaks the camel's back, that Saul disobeys him, and then he is rejected. Samuel delivers the message that Saul has been rejected as king, and David then is anointed as king in verse 16. But that whole context, really for the nation of Israel, the political context, is one of uncertainty. If you're sitting on the seat of Israel and you realize you've been rejected by God, really Israel isn't sure that God is truly behind them, that he is truly fighting for them. There's a lot to question that. And so this confrontation with the Philistines, as Israel sits on one side of a valley and the Philistines sit on the other, is definitely a test to see, is God going to fight for us? Is he still behind us? Has he completely disregarded his people because of our failings? And so this initial conflict, this one-on-one battle, which was a feature of ancient Near Eastern warfare, at times they would pick one champion to go against one champion, and that would determine the specific outcome of the battle. This skirmish, this conflict would reveal, is God behind us? The loser is going to serve and worship the other's God. And so if for Israel, if they lose, that means Yahweh, the Lord, our God, has kind of deserted us. His favor is no longer on us. And so that is the situation we come to in chapter 17. The Philistines gather their army at the valley of Elah. Verse 3, the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. There came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze, and he had bronze armor on his legs, a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. His spear head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves. Let him come down to me. If he is able to fight me and kill me, we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." The Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel today. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So the scene is set. He is challenging Israel, and Israel is struggling. This is really, as much as a military battle, this is a theological battle, but nobody is trusting God. The Philistines are confident in their gods and their military might and their power. Israel is not, and yet and they are fearful of what is going to happen. Now at the beginning we mentioned that any battle and any giant can be won by embodying the three things. Again, if you remember, the right status, utilizing the right resources, and relying on the right experience. Now, though the status, resource, and experience, those three things are listed in these descriptions of all three giants that we see in the story. And this first giant is, of course, Goliath. What is his status? What is his stature, you could even say? Goliath's status, his stature, is one of physical intimidating. He's a physically intimidating force. He's overwhelmingly intimidating in his status. He is 6 cubits and a span. The ancient tradition was that was 9 feet tall. I know conservative biblical scholars who think that's actually probably more like 6 feet 9. Either way, it doesn't matter. The kid in me wants it to be 9 feet tall. The realistic one in me thinks it could be 6'9". Either way, it doesn't matter. He was head and shoulders above the rest. He is physically powerful. Even the weight of his armor is significant, up to 125 pounds for his coat of mail. This was a significant warrior who is prepared and who is an intimidating force, undefeated warrior. What are his resources? Again, his training is significant. He's obviously a warrior trained in battle, but his unassailable armor, his unbeatable and unequaled armor, his javelin of bronze, his helmet of bronze, his coat of mail, all of these things are impenetrable protection for him. Verses 5 through 7 are significant pieces of armor. He is prepared for battle, unstoppable, and he's trusting in himself. He has, humanistically speaking, he has every reason to be confident and arrogant and boastful and challenging the Lord because of his unstoppable resources and his experience. He has vast experience. He's been, again, trained since he was a young man to fight. If you skip to verse 33, that this is mentioned. David is talking to Saul, and Saul is referring to this man he's about to face. And Saul said to David, "You were not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you were but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." So again, his experience. He has the status, he has the resources, he is equipped, and he has the experience, the best you could ever hope for. He is a warrior. And Goliath has faith in himself, and he is supremely confident. Goliath's faith is in himself, and has no worries about the outcome of this battle because of his status, his own resources, and his past experience. So that's Goliath. That's the first and most obvious giant. But I said there are more than one giant. And that's because as David enters the scene, as he is going to be used of God to conquer that giant, there are two other giants he has to get through before he can face the ultimate giant in Goliath. And the first giant is his brother Eliab. We're not going to read the verses, but the verses 12 through 23 describe him coming onto the scene. His father sends him to give him supplies to his brothers and check on them and make sure they're okay. And he sees Goliath come out and again speaking arrogantly and bragging and challenging them. And David can't believe it. Verse 24, all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid. And the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches and give him his daughter, make his house free in Israel," or tax-free, essentially. David said to the men, "What shall be done to this man who kills the Philistine? For this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God." Again, David sees this is defiance not of just a political or military might, but one that is challenging God himself. And David questioning, saying, "Why isn't anybody stepping up?" His older brother. I can understand this. I'm an older brother. I want to see my younger brothers, behave themselves in public. Verse 28, Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to them, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, "Why have you come down? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." Eliab's very critical. Eliab, David's own flesh and blood, is now challenging him and challenging his heart and challenging his motives about this whole situation. Eliab's status, if you turn back, obviously he's an older brother, but he had everything going for him, as much as you could hope for as a potential even new king. In chapter 16, verse 7 or 6, Samuel is coming to anoint the next king, and he knows it's in Jesse's family. He hasn't gotten to David, but he's going to start with the older brothers first. And verse 6, when he came, he looked on Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." All appearances would say Eliab's the man. He will be the next king. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on his height or stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." So it's significant that Eliab had the appearance of a leader. He has everything going for him, but he was not chosen to be the king. Now, also back in this story in chapter 17, he claims to have divine insight into David's heart. He thinks he knows his motives, and he's questioning him about that. And I think he's likely jealous of David as he questions him there. So Eliab's status is the appearance of a leader, but there is some question about his character, I think it's safe to say. Now, his resources. He also is a soldier trained for battle. Verse 2, verse 24, he would have been he was part of the army. The fact that he is trained, he has the resources in his training and his armor. And we Excuse me. And we see even at the end of the story, the men of Israel then go actually out and fight. It's not like they're just holding pitchforks and shovels against this mighty warrior with a bronze javelin. No, they had weapons too. They had armor as well. And after David defeats Goliath, they go out and rout the Philistines. So this man had the resources, and he had the experience. In verse 13, it seems very much like he would have been out in the almost not necessarily the front lines, but he would have been close to the battle. He would have had experience in battle, and he is described as a man versus David being a youth. So he has the age, he has the, technically you would think he would have had the experience to step up and fight, especially compared to David. But he doesn't have the true spiritual maturity that was needed in this battle. So Goliath had faith in himself and was supremely confident. He had every reason to be confident. Eliab has faith in appearances by how things look, but he is very doubtful of David's sincerity and doubtful that God can come through. So there is this giant, Eliab, David has to get through, and he does. He kind of ignores his brother, and eventually word gets to Saul, and Saul becomes the third giant in this story, the third thing that is hindering David from fulfilling God's will. Obviously, Goliath was challenging God's glory and God's honor. Eliab questions whether David is the right person to fight this battle, and now Saul tries to add his 2 cents, and Saul is the king. So status, resources, experience. Saul's status is one who he is the king. He has the responsibility to lead. He should have been the one to step up and fight Goliath. He has the outer appearance of a leader, of a great warrior, but he fails to have the inner character. The descriptions of Saul earlier on in the book, as he is being identified as the first king, he's a man of wealth, is one that comes from wealth. Chapter 9, verse 2. His name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. So he had all the appearances. He had everything going for him. The looks, the stature, the physical appearance. But he fails in his character. We see even before he is actually king, verse 23, they're looking for him. He's been proclaimed king, and he's hiding. They ran and looked and took him from there, and where he stood among the people, he's taller than anyone, their shoulders upward. That again, they were looking for him there, and they find him, but he seems a bit definitely passive, weak in some areas. He fails to have the true moral fortitude to fight these battles. So his status, he should have been willing and able to fight. His resources. Now he has the best human resources that could be offered. He has his own armor he tries to give David in verses 38 and 39. Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head, just like Goliath, and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. And David says, I can't go on with these. I haven't really practiced with these things. So Saul offers him the best human resources as possible, and Saul had those available for himself. And he tries to pass them along to David, but Saul's remedy isn't going to work either. Now Saul's experience, again, status, he was king. Resources, he had the best. His experience, he had led Israel to battles in the past. In chapter 10, chapter 11, verses 1 through 15 describe him defeating the Ammonites after he is anointed king. It's always a first test. They hear of a new ruler in this nation of Israel, and they want to test him. They want to go after him. And Saul is able to come through in verses 1 through 15, and it's a good victory. Notice, though, verse 10. I defy the ranks of Israel today. Give me a man that we may fight together. And Saul and all of Israel heard these words from the Philistines, and they were dismayed and greatly afraid. He had the experience, but he's unsure of himself. He knows his own weakness. He doesn't see how he could compare and defeat this. In fact, Goliath had faith in himself, was supremely confident. Eliab had faith in appearances and doubts David's true motives. Saul has faith in himself too, but is utterly scared out of his mind. He's utterly terrified. Saul's kind of the opposite of Goliath. He has faith in himself. He is putting faith in himself, his own resources, his own expertise, his own status, but he realizes he falls short. He doesn't measure up. And that becomes a problem. And so David has to work through that as well. He has to work through the best human armor money could buy. He has to get through his doubting brother. He has to work through Israel's king who stands in his way. Now David, these three giants are in contrast to David. Status, resources, experience. David's status. He has God's character. What is his resource? It's God's name. And his experience is God's deliverance. So let's look at David. He was a man after God's own heart. Acts chapter 13 verse 72 is where that famous phrase comes from. But we also see that elsewhere in chapter 1 Samuel 13 verse 14 is a description of a discussion between Saul and Samuel, and where the ominous clouds that Saul is being rejected kind of begin. But verse 14 says, "But now your kingdom," Samuel speaking to Saul, "your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." So as God has rejected Saul, he tells Saul, "I have found a man after my own heart." And who is that man? It's David. David's status is a simple shepherd boy. He's the youngest of a big family. He wouldn't have been expected to be a ruler of any kind, but he's a man after God's own heart, and that is what matters in God's economy, in God's consideration, from God's perspective. His status is one of a man after God's own heart. So even though he has no worldly stature, he has God's character. Now, what are his resources? Well, he couldn't go with man's resources. He tried man's resources, Saul's armor, and that didn't work. And really, that's almost a symbolic way of Saul giving his kingship away. When you took on the king's armor, that was essentially becoming king. But he wasn't going to do that either. His approach was unusual. David takes 5 items. Saul had 5 pieces of armor. And I think it's intentional in the narrative that it talks about, even though he only uses a sling and stones, it talks about David's items being a stick or a staff, the stones, a bag, and a pouch, and a sling. And even 5 stones. David is essentially anti-weaponry, if you will. He is rejecting the godless tools and godless weapons of warfare and is putting his trust in God. His approach is unusual. His resources, because he knows this battle is not about who's strongest or quickest or smartest even. It's who is trusting in the Lord of God of the universe. And that is what he comes with. Verse 45 and following, David said to the Philistines, "You come to me with a sword and a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you," with what? What is his resources? "In the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. I will strike you down and cut off your head. I will give the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the field, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And that all this assembly, everyone gathered here, may know that the Lord saves not with sword or spear, but the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." David's resources are not human resources. They're supernatural resources. It is God's name he is counting on to give him the deliverance for this battle. David has a theocentric perspective. His perspective is focused on God. His stature is one after God's own heart, and his resources are God's name. See, victory in these battles doesn't come from these externals. They come from our faith in God. No one's focused on God in this whole story. All the focus is on Goliath. David has the right focus. And he knows God will provide the victory. Now, David's experience, the last thing. David's experience is, David does have experience. It's just no experience anyone's ever really been familiar with. It's been out isolated in the hills and mountains and valleys tending sheep. And those sheep needed protection. And so his experience had been God's deliverance. He was untested militarily, but he was a man who had shepherded and led sheep, yes, but he had been in this position before. He had defeated predators, verses 36 and 37. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and the uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. So Saul said, go, the Lord be with you, go. So David realized he doesn't even take credit for killing a lion and a bear. He said, the Lord gave me protection and deliverance from the lion and the bear. See, David understood all battles owe their outcome to the Lord. He realized any battle and any giant can be defeated, no matter even their physical representation, maybe even the specific situation you find yourself in, this specific giant you are facing. Any battle and any giant can be won when we trust the right resources, lean on the right experience, and embody the right status or stature. He embraced God's heart, he trusted God's resources, and he experienced God's deliverance. And that is really the key to this story. He had faith in God, and he fundamentally rejected man's natural, I can do it approach. That's the key to the story of David and Goliath. Trust in God and reject man's natural, manipulative even, I can do it approach. Embrace God's heart, trust God's resources, and experience God's deliverance for yourself. It's not about our status or our stature, how big and strong you are, what job title you hold. It's not about how much money you have in the bank. It's not about what your resume looks like and how professional you have been. It's about embracing God's heart, having the character that depends on Him and what Christ has done for us. It's trusting God's resources, the power of God that has been made available to all of us, and then we can experience God's deliverance. And we see that deliverance in verse 48. Might as well get to the climax of the story. When the Philistine arose and came and drew to meet David, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet the Philistine. David is bold. And David put in his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine in the forehead, and the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. Now, military experts, even modern military experts, have proven, I've seen it on the History Channel, you can look it up, slingshots can do a lot of damage. You hit somebody square in the forehead, you are impairing them greatly, if not killing them. Now, I don't know that he even killed him. I believe he probably stunned him or paralyzed him, because we see what happens next. David makes sure the job is done. David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There's no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of his sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that the champion was dead, they fled. The men of Israel and Judah, oh, now we'll get up and fight. They rose with a shout, and they pursued the Philistines as far as Gath, against Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell in the way from all of these places. Verse 53, the people of Israel came back chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine, brought it to Jerusalem, and he put his armor in his tent. Victory. It was God's. David never takes credit, never wants the honor. But it's because he defied the Lord of hosts that this giant need to be taken down. And David does that. He didn't have any stature, humanly speaking. He had no resources militarily. He had no experience even fighting giants. But victory doesn't come from the externals. Victory comes when we embrace God's heart and the status he has given us, who we are in Christ. What is your identity? You're a child of God. 2, God's resources. Trusting God's name. Trusting that he will do what he says he will do. Pursuing his will no matter what. And then thirdly, experience God's deliverance when we do that. It's a powerful lesson. And I think those are maybe some, hopefully you have been encouraged, some undiscovered truths of this very familiar passage. David faces 3 giants, 3 men who thought, humanly speaking, they had the right status, the right resources, and the right experience, but they fell short. They failed because they didn't trust the Lord. And that's the key. When we embrace God's will, embody the right status, utilizing the right resources, and relying on the right experiences. Any situation where you find yourself where God's name is being questioned, where his name is at stake, that situation can be redeemed. It can be conquered. Any giant who is trying to diminish God's glory or hinder you in the pursuit of God's honor and glory and God's will, they can be conquered when we embody the right status, utilize the right resources, and rely on the right experience. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed it. We'll move on to the rest of our service, and we'll be praying that the Lord encourages you and that you remember to focus on him, not the externals, not the appearances, not the man-made labels or man-made identities that they try to give us, but who are we in Christ? Thank you.